When you look at art as a career, one of the big questions is always, why does something succeed where others fail? There are some simple answers. You can try to look at individual projects in a vacuum and think about them that way, but it's not really how a creative career works. Once just a street artist, Banksy, who is now a team of people and not just one individual, started off as an unknown and grew in popularity by being a talented part of an equally growing art scene. Today, wealthy patrons will pay millions just to have Banksy shred his own work after they buy it, and any subtle criticism of the financial portion of his career ironically only makes him more valuable, for the time being. In 2010, Banksy released a documentary called Please Exit Through the Gift Shop, about how the street art scene itself grew. And while Banksy was talented, he was buoyed by an entire movement. One individual to be swept up in all of this was a strange man who habitually filmed everything. He had himself on camera, interacting with many popular artists in the scene, and though he himself never did any art at the time, when it became a way to make money, he was able to pass himself off as one of the artists, and he paid other people to make paintings for him, which he sold as his own at incredible prices. The footage he recorded ultimately was used to make the documentary and to criticize his fraud, no less. The documentary ended with one of the scene's leading artists saying, "It just goes to show, the joke is on..." Actually, I don't know who the joke is on. I mean, what was the moral of it all? They weren't sure, and that was the end of it. It's a poignant note, I think. The artists hired to make the paintings got their pay, and all the major artists worked with teams themselves. The patrons got their paintings. The man committing fraud really had been part of that movement, even if not a real artistic force, and it wasn't clear if revealing the truth about it honestly mattered. People even speculated that the man, Thierry Guetta, had all along been part of an art piece orchestrated by Banksy, or that Guetta was Banksy, which meant he continued to sell. Can you even really call it fraud? Is that fraud? Who is the joke on? Life has patterns, but it does not make poetry. The only reason the universe tells a joke now and then is because it would have to stumble into the occasional comedy routine for life to exist. As the universe tips its hat and plods away, we always say, "Isn't it funny?" And no one is ever laughing because it's a bit frightening when something so big nearly steps on you. And as life moves more online, the entire economy is built on patterns. In order to survive to where we are today, we had to evolve to be able to form them in our heads, the patterns. This pattern is shaped like a friend, and that one is shaped like a snarling wolf, which could be a friend for that matter if you have enough leftovers from the other night's cookout. This pattern of berries is safe to eat. Well, that one over there will cause you to break out in hives every single time. Everything we interact with is a collection of patterns jumbled together into a heuristic, which is just barely enough information to get the job done, and the heuristics aren't always correct. We only do our best. What we've created now, however, are pattern-serving machines, programs which jumble patterns together for us based on patterns it recognizes. It serves them up on a silver platter and says, "Here you are." And these patterns certainly look like friends sometimes, and if you accept what it offers you, it remembers that, and it tries to get you to take the next one. Gradually, it creates new patterns by trying to make sense of the disorganized mess that is the universe simply bumping into everything. The earth is flat. Medicine is deadly. Invest in pictures of the world's most hideous apes. And isn't it funny? By the time it offers you some of these plates, you've already followed the patterns the machine used to get there, because you're pattern-seeking creatures, you and the machine. You see the same patterns now, or else you couldn't have got here. In a way, it highlights the things within us that made Christ demand that those without sin cast the first stones. We're all mistaken about so many things all the time. If the person, or the machine, standing next to you casts a stone, for what reason does it throw it? The crowd throws the stones because you wouldn't want to speak up and be the one the crowd is throwing stones at. Better to go along sometimes. The crowd, these machines, these companies, they must know what they're doing. Or at least know where you live, for sure. I recall as the internet shrank and the places that you could share your content began to die off, there was a great change in how we talked about art. For one, it became content because artists objected to some of the largest YouTube channels being described as art. We stopped thinking about what small in-groups would like and drifted away from fandoms, or nerddoms in the real sense. It became less viable to make things for fans of something that you could clearly identify and find. Now, instead, all work gradually became required to fit a pattern that everyone can recognize. These patterns are always being tweaked and nudged by the systems presenting them, with those systems trying to maximize revenue at every turn. Even if you make art for passion, you find yourself in this system, because there are a few monopolies in charge, and if you want people to see what you made, you have to work with what you're allowed. What we have now are less fandoms, and instead fans, blobby and homogenous, though blobby less from being overweight like the fans that we used to have, and now just blobby in the indistinct sense. Not like the ones that I grew up with, who would get in a bloody fist fight in the Games Workshop parking lot just because you talked a bit too much smack on Batman. I'm not saying the old fans with their sharp edges were better. No. I just had a clearer picture of what would make some of those guys smack me in the face and what really made them such ridiculous hyper fans. It was harder to find one another and more necessary to band together. And if your friend had never heard of Red Dwarf, first you had to ask, and then you had to show them your extensive VHS collection. Once you've bought every issue of Batman and the assumption you'll have to show other people these things someday, it's hard not to be a little obsessive. Fandoms turning indistinctly into fans is a mixed blessing. On the one hand, I'm no longer afraid that my local game shop is going to go bankrupt. Every time I visit, there are 3 or 4 people in the aisles perusing the board games or looking at Warhammer models. The tables are always filled, and you can pick up a game at any time. It's a good thing and a good feeling. It's no longer the onus of myself as an individual to hoard troves of paraphernalia and the assumption that I have to personally indoctrinate someone. These online systems do that job for me. The shop I used to play my old role-playing games at went out of business, with the owner asking us if we had any more friends who might want to be a part of fandom. But my current place feels alive. Yet I don't really know many of the patrons there. I see them, we nod and smile to each other if we make eye contact, and occasionally I recognize a guy I played 40k with back when I still did play the game. I don't know exactly what drew all of these people to their hobby unless I talked to them about it. My hobby store went from a small town to a city, in a sense. Busy, but with so many faces I don't always notice them, and I don't always see them again. People still, and I can always talk to them, but regardless, it's funny being surrounded by strangers in a space that used to require leading everyone to it by their hand. Sometimes I chuckle to myself when I go to a surviving bookstore, and I see a small group of well-groomed people standing in front of the Space Marine novellas. My, how times have changed. It used to take a certain type, and this is where the musings tie back into making things and what becomes popular. Who makes it in this terrible online ecosystem? People who naturally thrive in it is who. Imagine yourself being PewDiePie or Mr. Beast. Let's not worry about their current standing, just imagine you have their career. Every day you wake up, you sit down at your computer, and you try to come up with some kind of trash to put online. You don't write stories, you don't really have any specific problems to solve, legal conflicts notwithstanding. Your career just revolves around doing what they do. Playing video games every single day, tying your shoes in every state, airdropping money onto the homeless with no explanation. You can't do that for 6, 7, 8, 10 years if you don't have the personality for it. If you can't imagine yourself waking up and saying, "I've got it, I'll adopt every dog at the local shelter for a video this month," you aren't really cut out to be Mr. Beast for half a decade. I think even Mr. Beast has realized that he can't be Mr. Beast forever, which is why he's tried to invest in a chain of restaurants that would have, in theory, created enough cash flow to keep him afloat if YouTube decided to go in a different direction. Back in maybe 2012 or 2013, the shape of the internet changed dramatically. I used to keep up with articles posted by Frederator, previously one of the major companies leading the change, on the dream of a healthy online entertainment world. They were an animation studio, yes, but they were also a multi-channel network with access to vast swaths of data. Their projections for the future grew dimmer and dimmer. Their own shows were flailing, and while you might point to problems with their shows as a reason why, the data that they had showed that everyone, everywhere, who might have been welcome to call themselves artists, were beginning to slip through the cracks. One article explained, to make it on the internet, it was no longer sustainable to try to make content that is good. You have to start making content that is good enough. Barring a few notable examples, this has remained frustratingly true for all these years. Sometimes you see something that is legitimately good, but these products are often made now by professionals with years of experience, because to make something that is legitimately good and yet retains broad appeal to everyone takes a lot of skill. Multimedia projects are complicated, and if you fail in any area, the entire thing may as well be trash. If the writing is weak, then nobody cares about the characters and it'll fall through. If the score is flat, then the product loses emotional depth. If the characters on screen lack appeal, people will just dismiss it offhand. If the acting is poor, it takes the audience out of it. These projects represent a substantial and challenging multidisciplinary risk. They will always suffer from their weakest link. There are a few who can pull this off almost totally solo. Worthy Kids comes to mind, and so does Felix Colgrave. They make content that is largely original and so well done that they perhaps can't help but succeed. There's so much passion and character in either of those artist creations, and they're both so clearly their own work. However, Colgrave might not have risen up if he hadn't done hired work in the first place, specifically gaining traction from Fever the Ghost, and if he hadn't started as far back as he did. Worthy Kids, likewise, has a foot in the early days of YouTube and periodically makes pop culture jokes, which are good to extend his reach since people enjoy their familiar trappings. Some people talk about Vivzy Pop, who granted is superficially living the dream that many online artists held in the early days. However, her works involve a team of specialists, which is a lot of overhead, and if her cash flow drops below a certain threshold, there will be no way to cover those costs. She additionally got her start back in the early days and grew fame from a music video, which she leveraged into hype for the series that she is now working on. However, it's a house of cards, and while I have no reason to think that she's going to fail, and I'm not predicting that she will, it also wouldn't be surprising if she does, just because her situation is financially precarious. It's the business. We can't, on a practical level, say that Vivzy is successful until well after the fact, and history proves it. I'm not rooting for Vivzy to fail by any stretch. The opposite. When an artist like her succeeds, it inspires more people to try. And more people trying to make it work and break into the craft means it is more likely that someone is going to work out a winning formula that the rest of us can learn from. We can't get anywhere without risk-takers and pioneers. She's done what some couldn't, and it will be good for all of us if she can go further. But the real dream, of course, is to sustain, and to continue telling your stories and be heard telling them. Being heard is really one of the most important things to artists. We practice and we work, and not everything is released in the expectation of success, but we hope that someone will hear us. There might be some people who derive pleasure from being unseen and unfound, but they must be very good at it because I've never heard of them. Creating is its own reward, yeah, but it pales in comparison to being told by someone that you inspired them to create things too. The echo reverberates on. Some artists don't grow in their time, but the sound carries forward, widening out, and long after their death, the people realize the goodness in the works that the artist did. In the next artist's own ways, in their works, they carry on the mantle. Yet, it is so much harder to be heard now than ever. It's the patterns. We have to make patterns. Display a pattern that can quickly be recognized, that can be engaged with. Copy a meme, commentate on a major pop culture subject. Make aspersions about your political enemies. Match the heuristics. Become the pattern. Be what the audience expects. Be what the system expects as it matches the audience to the patterns. The system will not insist you have to watch the first 3 episodes of a dumb anime show to get it. It won't try to suck you in or talk you into it like a person would. If you don't finish that first episode, it abandons it and moves on to something that already fits your heuristic perspective. It finds a well-worn rut in the floor and has you pace it again. If you're bored, maybe it goes a bit deeper, introduces something that still fits the pattern, but with a little variance. And there you are, nudged a little, not exactly looking at something new. Oh, what it is to wake up each day and strive to be something that someone has already seen, but only slightly different. A slight variation on a meme. If you can't imagine yourself being that, embracing it, then it won't come naturally to you, and you won't be able to do it with any level of sincerity for the next 5 or 10 years as a career. The people who do that aren't cynically figuring out trends. They get into it by genuinely enjoying the memes and having a proclivity towards making that kind of stuff. Anyone who sardonically competes in that market with loathing will find themselves competing with hundreds of artists who genuinely love making slight variations of memes. If there's no love, you will not keep up with them. They will blow you out of the water simply by the law of averages. This is an emergent reality, a system built on incredible scales of human interaction. You will not outsmart it. You can't. I grew popular for parodies of My Little Pony fanfiction. It was a large and proper fandom with unique spaces to communicate with people who were in the fandom. I knew who would want to hear my jokes, and where I should be interacting online, and I shared my videos there. I introduced it to my friends, and whenever I made something new, I'd get the guys together, we'd drink beer, and they'd laugh at it. It felt good. It was fun. People still look down on the pony fandom to this day, but I really don't care much for those opinions. As the fandom broke apart, I watched two of my nearest competitors split off in their own directions. Jenny Nicholson went on to be exactly the kind of person I'm talking about. She made content reviewing pop culture, offering up blunt and off-color observations that the majority of people already share. I don't think she went on to do that as part of a cynical move. I think it was pathology. She seems like the type to get a little hyperfixated, and I don't think for a second that the person you're seeing on screen is a character. That is probably her. Like, she is probably legitimately a bit awkward. She is probably a little off-color. And the fairly safe opinions that she expresses are almost certainly her real, genuine takes. Her job is to be Jenny Nicholson, odd as that may seem as a career path. Griffinilla, on the other hand, took a more calculated approach. He began Let's Plays for the children's space on YouTube, playing such games as Roblox, Bendy and the Ink Machine, and Plants vs. Zombies. He also made music about popular culture items like Undertale, Five Nights at Freddy's, or Overwatch at its release. With him, I'm not sure that he really did care about any of those things. He was a talented musician and clearly wanted to do music, but he also wanted to succeed and afford rent, which is fairly reasonable. His channels did all right, and he probably made decent money. At least until YouTube began to crack down on the children's space, after which he disappeared for a while. My assumption was that he probably went on to work as a musician, because he's a talented musician and that would be an option for him. My perspective is simply that I don't think he fully had the personality to play Five Nights at Freddy's as a long career, and lucrative or not, if I were him, I would have welcomed a change of scenery at some point. He tried to be Fandroid, but that wasn't entirely who he was, and it's tough to be a different person from your natural self for 15 to 30 minutes every week. Not everyone can do that for years at a stretch. Aside from that, they don't promote Let's Plays as much now, so it's no longer a solid business decision. I always say, I envy the money that either of them made, but never really envy the career path. Like, I can't imagine myself sitting in front of a camera with a silly hat on while I talk about company products, and then embracing that as the fundamental bread and butter of my livelihood. I tried Let's Plays and personally got tired of it. And even then, I spent a lot of time trying to make them into something more artistically interesting to me, even if it didn't help me reach a broader audience. Some people talk about my MechWarrior 4 Let's Plays as being especially interesting because I stripped out the audio from the game, added my own sound effects I put together by banging glass bottles and cans together, and then completely rewrote it into a new story. I really liked MechWarrior 4. I replayed it all the time. In my head, I always imagined that people who had never played the game would see my Let's Play, and if they decided to play it themselves, my own rendition couldn't ruin the real deal for them. Same thing with the Soul Reaver Let's Play, where I replaced the dialogue with a bunch of goofy jokes and asides. The real dialogue is still intact for you to discover on your own. And in that way that we used to have to hand-lead people to our nerdy hobbies and interests, I wanted my audience to experience those things without outright stealing them or, tarnishing them. I like those games, and I think you should too. That was my impetus. So here's the actual clicker. Are we going to do more MLP shots? And yes, I did in fact bury this question under 6 pages of aimless musing about online artistry. In fact, I'm also not going to dress this up. I'm going to leave it bland so that many people will see it and dismiss it entirely. Not for any reason, really. I just hate Twitter and YouTube and the rest of the social medias. Though I can't call the leading content creators of social media truly insincere, to say that I care for these systems myself would be fraudulent. The answer is that PetaRep is interested, and I've been thinking about doing some of these ideas for a while. We may again do some pony, but when and how often, that's hard to say. I expect that a second video would have probably a pretty considerable drop-off in viewership as the novelty wears off, but it's like catching up on 10 years of missed time with old friends. It wouldn't go on indefinitely, but we might have more come out. This is not where the essay ends. Whether I make more MLP content or not, I'm still going to be doing something. The online world is always shrinking at the same time that it grows larger. And with advents in AI technology, I think that going forward, the business of spreading via memes will grow intolerably worse. AI is not great at understanding anything, but it is good at identifying patterns and getting better at creating things based on patterns. Imagine a world where you see a new online trend, and within minutes, thousands of computers are vomiting out hundreds of AI-generated images which are nothing but that meme with modest alterations. It could put the old Facebook content farms to shame. The fact that these things can't be copyrighted will be of no consolation, because the money won't be in the art itself, but rather the attention that it gathers. However, such a proliferation of AI content would mean that any meme would run its course and no longer be enjoyable within maybe the span of a day. These things have already suffered a lot from shortened lifespans due to oversaturation by humans, so computers printing them at lightning speed probably won't make them last any longer. I dare say that in the future, I expect the collapse of the meme economy, if we can even say such a thing exists. But will it kill actual art? I think that would remain to be seen, and it's still so far unlikely. The machines work with patterns. They create patterns, they respond to patterns. That said, if you really need something like a kitchen background or ideas for character concepts, artists will at some point adopt these tools and make things using AI because it's beneficial to have less overhead. People with a proclivity towards art will simply want to make things, using the path of least resistance, often, or at least the path which appeals most to them. In fact, I already know people using AI to make honest work, not with nefarious intent, but because they're working by themselves and don't have cash to hire help. We won't really have a choice in the matter. There will be thousands of us competing for attention, and at lengths of time and at scale, certain behaviors will outcompete others. After all, I can be sanctimonious about people making six figures from derivative content when I myself owe most of my notoriety to parodies of someone else's content. It just goes to show the joke's on I don't know who, really.